In the harsh winter of 1888, a team of fishermen operating on the frozen expanse of Lake Superior's outer edge retrieved something from the ice that defied all explanation. It wasn't a corpse or fragments of a shipwreck, it was a boy alive and breathing. Estimated to be between 12 and 14 years old, he possessed dark, watchful eyes that seemed to observe without any glimmer of recognition. Clad in fabrics utterly alien to every man present on that frozen shelf, he showed no signs of hypothermia or frostbite. By all medical logic, he should have perished. He hadn't. Within a span of 48 hours, a local doctor, a Presbyterian clergyman, and 2 agents from the recently established Bureau of Ethnology in Washington were all gathered around this child, engaged in heated, hushed debate over the enigma before them. The physician concluded that the boy's physiology fell completely outside his medical understanding. The minister, Button, asserted that the child appeared to be engaged in prayer, yet the language bore no similarity to any Native American dialect he knew. The ethnologists remained silent, having been discreetly instructed to reserve their observations until they could report to their superiors. The boy was subsequently moved to a Duluth facility. A month later, he was relocated again. The official documentation detailing his destination is non-existent. What remains are 3 private letters, a collection of field notes inscribed in a cramped script on paper now partially damaged by water, and a photograph that emerged from a 1974 estate sale in Wisconsin. This image depicts a young boy seated on a wooden stool, his gaze fixed directly on the camera, wearing an expression that one collector described as deeply disquieting, the look of someone who has already observed their current surroundings from an external vantage point and found them precisely as limited as anticipated. The language he spoke has never been definitively classified, yet several independent researchers over the last century have converged on a similarly unsettling conclusion about what it most closely mirrors. This conclusion does not point forward to some obscure tribe hidden in the North American wilderness. Instead, it points backward, significantly backward, to a tongue that, according to conventional historical narratives, should not have been spoken by anyone alive in 1888, nor in fact by anyone alive for centuries prior. This is the narrative of the Lake Superior boy, and at its core it is a story about what becomes buried, what is neglected, and what sometimes unexpectedly breaks through the ice. To grasp why this case has garnered such importance within certain investigative circles, we must first understand the context of the Lake Superior region in the years preceding 1888. The boy's emergence was not an isolated incident. It occurred at the crossroads of several converging factors in that area at that specific historical moment, and this convergence is far from accidental. The 1880s saw Lake Superior undergoing rapid industrial transformation. The Sioux locks had been enlarged in 1881, opening the Great Lakes system to much heavier commercial shipping. Mining enterprises in Michigan's Upper Peninsula were extracting copper and iron ore at rates unseen since the pre-Columbian era. This last point is quietly significant because the ancient copper mines of Lake Superior have never been fully rationalized by standard archaeology. The scale is staggering. Estimates indicate that between 500,000 and 750,000 tons of copper were extracted from the Lake Superior region during antiquity, primarily from 3000 BCE to roughly 1200 CE. This represents an immense quantity of metal, enough to supply substantial industrial operations. Yet, within the accepted archaeological framework of North America, there is no evidence of a civilization large, organized, or technologically advanced enough to have utilized this copper. The metal largely vanishes from the record. The mines and the tools used to work them are visible, but the ultimate destination of the metal itself remains a mystery. Those who investigate what is broadly termed the Tartarian question, the possibility of a significantly more advanced global civilization predating the one we are taught, have long regarded the Great Lakes as one of the most significant anomalous zones on the continent. The sheer volume of copper extraction alone points to the existence of an organized, sophisticated culture operating here for millennia. It left behind mines, earthworks, and a copper-working tradition that appeared without clear precedent and faded without a clear successor. According to standard historical accounts, this culture simply ceased to exist. Alternatively, it may not have vanished. It might have relocated, either literally or metaphorically, beneath the surface into the interior, into the cavern networks that lie under the lake and its environs. These systems have been described in regional indigenous oral traditions for generations as being older than memory and more extensive than any chart made by living people. The fishing crew that discovered the boy in February 1888 was operating on an ice shelf roughly 14 miles from the closest settlement. Their purpose was routine, checking their lines, not searching for anomalies. The buoy was found at the edge of a natural opening in the ice, a phenomenon known as a polynya, maintained by upwelling currents from below. He was seated at its margin, not floating in the water. His hands rested in his lap. His eyes were open. His attire showed no evidence of water damage despite his clear proximity to the adjacent open water. The lead fisherman's account, later transcribed by the minister who documented the case, notes that the boy's initial reaction to the crew was not fear, but recognition, not of the specific individuals, but of the encounter itself. As if he had been prepared for such a meeting and had been anticipating it, they transported him back on the sled. He offered no resistance. He spoke no language any of them understood. He ate what was provided, and then sat near the fire for hours, watching it with an intensity that one crew member later characterized as being akin to someone observing a creation of their own to verify it was still functioning properly. A physician, Dr. Eldridge Aldous Kemper, whose records are partially preserved in the St. Mary's Hospital archives in Duluth, examined the boy within 2 days of his discovery. Kemper's preliminary notes are precise and clinical, detailing the boy's physical condition, apparent age, dentition, musculature, and reflexes. However, about halfway through the second page, the tone shifts. Kemper writes that the boy's thoracic cavity appears to be configured in a manner slightly at odds with standard anatomical expectation. He does not elaborate, simply circles the phrase and adds a marginal note, "Ask about this," with no indication of whom he intended to consult. On the third page, he comments on a residue found within the boy's clothing. Kemper had extracted a small sample from the inner lining of a garment he described as robe-like, composed of an unidentified material. The residue, he noted, possessed unexplained properties, including an extremely fine metallic component, almost granular, which caught the light in a way that made it appear, from certain angles, as if illuminated from within. Reverend James Harrow arrived a few days after the physician. Harrow was a seasoned traveler, having served in mission territories in the Pacific Northwest and possessing some familiarity with various indigenous language families. He had been summoned because word had spread that the boy was speaking in an unintelligible tongue. Harrow's account, preserved in a lengthy letter to a Chicago seminary colleague and first brought to public attention by a researcher in 2011, provides the most detailed primary documentation of the boy's language. Harrow reports spending 3 days listening to the boy speak. He describes the phonology as containing sounds absent from any indigenous language he knew, as well as any European language. Long vowel sequences with an ancient quality and a consistent use of glottal stops in non-arbitrary patterns suggested a structured grammar. Although he could not decipher the grammar itself, he was convinced it existed. He then wrote a sentence that has made his letter one of the most referenced documents in Tartarian research circles. He records that on the second evening, the boy deliberately spoke a phrase slowly, giving Harrow the strong impression that this was not spontaneous speech but a recitation of memorized material, something passed down, prepared for precisely this type of moment. Harrow could not translate it, but the closest phonetic parallel he could identify was in descriptions from an 1872 site in upstate New York, hastily closed by the Smithsonian, whose own field notes referenced proto-writing associated with a civilization they declined to name. The Smithsonian connection is not trivial. The institution's handling of anomalous archaeological finds in the late 19th century is among the most documented and simultaneously most systematically overlooked subjects in the study of American prehistory. A consistent pattern appears across numerous cases. Unusual artifacts or remains are discovered. Smithsonian representatives arrive promptly. Materials are collected, and the record either falls silent or is revised to remove the most anomalous elements. The 2 men who arrived in Duluth on behalf of the Bureau of Ethnology in 1888 were on site within a week of the boy's discovery. Their names appear in St. Mary's Hospital's administrative visitor log. After that, they vanish from any case-related documentation. A researcher who submitted a formal Freedom of Information request for the Bureau's report in 2009 received a response acknowledging the document's existence but classifying it under provisions applied retroactively, a bureaucratic curiosity, as the cited provisions were not created until 1917. The first theory suggests he was taken to a federal facility in Washington, D.C., likely one of the research annexes associated with the Smithsonian, where he was studied before either dying naturally or succumbing to a condition related to his removal from his original environment. This theory is supported by a single sentence in an 1889 private letter from a mid-level Bureau of Ethnology official, which vaguely refers to the matter of the lake boy as concluded without further detail. The second theory is more challenging to dismiss and more difficult to accept. It proposes that the boy was returned not to a conventional family or community, but to his point of origin, that the ice opening where he was found was not an accident of geography but an interface, a connection between what lies below and what exists above, and that the officials from Washington understood this, recognizing that the boy's appearance on the surface had been intentional, a communication, a signal that something below remained active, operational, and aware of the world above the ice. This second theory demands belief in things conventional history says are impossible. It requires accepting the existence of an inhabited subterranean world beneath the Lake Superior Basin, sustained over centuries without detection. It demands acceptance that this world's inhabitants speak a language predating all known linguistic families. It requires believing that in the winter of 1888 they chose to send a child to the surface as an emissary, a test, or something for which we have no word in our vocabulary, a concept belonging to a system of knowledge we have long since forgotten. The standard academic response to these anomalies is to address each in isolation, seeking localized explanations and avoiding connections. The Tartarian hypothesis argues that this very approach is flawed. When connections are drawn, when anomalies are allowed to inform each other rather than being confined to separate boxes, what appears is not a collection of mysteries but an outline, a shape suggesting something vast that existed before us, and whose record has been systematically compressed, distorted, or removed. What ended that period is one of the central questions in Tartarian research. The most discussed candidate is a catastrophic event in the mid to late first millennium CE, possibly linked to extraterrestrial impact or what some researchers describe as a deliberate technological reset. Evidence comes from multiple sources: the stratigraphic record, the abrupt disappearance of certain cultural traditions, and an anomalous chronological gap in the records of virtually every surviving Northern Hemisphere culture clustered around the same approximate period. If such a civilization did collapse, what became of its most deeply embedded members? Those located underground, in mining operations, storage facilities, and the institutional infrastructure of that world, it is not obvious that they would have ceased to exist, nor that they would have emerged to a surface that evidence suggests had become catastrophically inhospitable. The indigenous traditions of the Lake Superior region do in fact describe something living beneath the lake. This is not to say they depict a literal entity in any straightforward sense, but they do preserve, frequently in compressed and symbolically veiled forms, recollections of genuine historical occurrences. The Mishipeshu tradition is specifically tied to Lake Superior, intimately connected to its deep waters and its copper deposits. It is also associated with the periodic emergence of things from the depths that have no place in the upper world, entities that rise through the profound places and must be approached with caution, for they carry within them a wisdom that the surface realm has lost the capacity to simply absorb. The boy in the ice need not be a literal emissary of the Mishipeshu for this tradition to hold relevance. It matters because it demonstrates that the peoples who have inhabited the Lake Superior region longest have preserved, across generations, the understanding that something resides beneath this lake that is not merely geological, something that periodically initiates contact, something that retains the memory of what the surface world has chosen to forget. The photograph recovered from the 1974 estate sale warrants closer scrutiny than it has typically received. The estate belonged to a woman named Margaret Ormsby, who passed away at 91 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Among her possessions was a substantial collection of documents pertaining to her grandfather's career as a minor federal official in the Midwest during the late 19th century. Most of this material was unremarkable. The photograph was not formally catalogued during the estate's initial processing. It was discovered tucked within the cover of a personal journal that otherwise contained nothing out of the ordinary: recipe, weather observations, household expenditure records. The image depicts a boy, estimated by researchers to be about 13 years old, seated in a wooden chair against a plain backdrop. He wears what appears to be a standard institutional garment of that era. His feet are bare, his hands rest in his lap. He gazes directly into the lens, and his expression is precisely what the estate sale collector described: not inquisitive, not fearful, not the vacant stare of dissociation, but a stillness that reads as profound perspective. As if the individual in the chair is mentally situated at a considerable remove from their immediate circumstances, capable of seeing both the room and what the room represents with equal clarity. On the reverse of the photograph, in handwriting that matches nothing else found in the Ormsby collection, are 7 characters that do not form any word or abbreviation in any European language. These symbols do not correspond to any formally catalogued alphabet. Two researchers have independently suggested a partial correlation with one of the undeciphered scripts from the pre-Columbian period, found at various sites across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes region, described in the limited academic literature that addresses it as a candidate for an independent writing system associated with a cultural complex that aligns with no named archaeological tradition. One of these researchers, a linguist who devoted 2 decades to studying pre-Columbian North American inscription systems, wrote in a private communication to a colleague, shared publicly only after his death, that if one allows oneself to study the photograph for an extended period and to sit with the characters on its reverse without immediately grasping for an explanation, what arises is not the unease of the unknown. What arises is the specific unease of the half-remembered, as if the image is not introducing you to something alien, but reminding you of something you once knew and have since been conditioned to suppress. However, the compelling dimension of this framework does not actually depend on conspiracy. The serious iteration does not require that anyone is actively suppressing information in the present day. It requires only that a catastrophic collapse occurred at some point in antiquity, that this collapse was sufficiently comprehensive to obliterate most of the material evidence of the preceding civilization, and that the intellectual traditions which subsequently developed evolved in the absence of that evidence, constructing their models of human history around a void they were not equipped to recognize as such. This is not an outlandish claim. It is, in fact, something that occurs with some regularity in the history of science. Entire disciplines spend decades building upon foundations that ultimately prove incomplete, not because anyone was being deceptive, but because the missing information was simply inaccessible. The discovery of that missing information does not require a conspiracy. It requires an anomaly, something that surfaces through the ice and refuses to fit the prevailing model. The boy from Lake Superior represents an anomaly of the most acute variety. Not because he constitutes proof of anything, the primary documentation is fragmentary and the chain of custody is compromised, but because the surviving details do not resolve into any conventional explanation. He was discovered alive in conditions that should have been fatal. His garments were fashioned from materials the physician could not identify. The residue within those garments displayed metallic properties inconsistent with anything in the region's known material culture. The language he spoke could not be placed within any recognized linguistic family. And then he vanished into the institutional apparatus of the federal government and was never documented again. There is a concept in the philosophy of science known as the anomaly budget. It refers informally to the number of unexplained observations a given theory can absorb before the anomalies begin to constitute a challenge to the theory itself, rather than simply a list of phenomena the theory has not yet accounted for. Every scientific model carries a certain tolerance for the unexplained. What it cannot sustain indefinitely is the accumulation of anomalies that consistently point in the same direction. The Tartarian hypothesis, in its most defensible form, is the assertion that conventional history's anomaly budget is depleted, that the volume of phenomena the model cannot explain has reached a point where the responsible intellectual response is not to add them to a list, but to question whether the model itself requires replacement. The copper mines are in the budget, the architectural irregularities are in the budget, the linguistic parallels are in the budget, the maps depicting unknown geography are in the budget. The geometric earthworks aligned with astronomical phenomena are in the budget. The boy from Lake Superior, with his unknown language, his unidentifiable materials, and his expression of calm detachment, is in the budget. Embracing this would mean accepting that human history on this continent is considerably older and more intricate than the conventional account suggests. It would mean acknowledging that civilizational collapse is a demonstrated reality, something that has occurred on this land within a time frame recent enough in geological terms to be disturbing. It would mean accepting that the survivors of that collapse may still exist in some form in the places where survival was viable, which is to say underground, in the deep systems beneath a lake so vast that its interior has never been fully charted. It would also mean taking seriously the possibility that the boy in the ice was not an accident, that he was dispatched, that whatever community produced him possessed sufficient knowledge of the world above the ice to understand what a child's emergence on its surface would signify to those who discovered him, that they selected a child because a child is the universal signal of non-aggression, of openness, of the desire for continuation rather than conflict, that the language he spoke was not arbitrary but prepared, a greeting in the tongue of the civilization that preceded, offered to the representatives of the civilization that followed in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize it. The photograph now resides in a private collection. The field notes are partially legible. Reverend Harrow's letter is held by a small historical society in Illinois that has not digitized it. St. Mary's Hospital records were partially destroyed in a 1923 fire. The Bureau of Ethnology report remains classified under provisions enacted 3 decades after the boy's discovery, and beneath Lake Superior in winter the pollinia still open, small patches of open water in the ice maintained by the pressure of whatever moves below. The fishermen who work those waters know them. They know to avoid them because the currents that sustain them are unpredictable, and because there have been, over the years, stories about what is found near them. Nothing as dramatic as a living child seated calmly at the edge of the ice, his hands in his lap, his eyes open, speaking in a language older than the lake itself. The question of why 1888 specifically is one that researchers have revisited repeatedly. The timing is not obviously significant in any historical sense. There was no particular event in that year that would explain why a contact attempt, if that is what it was, would be made at that moment rather than in any of the preceding decades or centuries. The United States was expanding rapidly. Industrial resource extraction in the Lake Superior region was at its peak. The copper mines were operating at a pace unprecedented since the ancient extraction period. That last detail may constitute the answers. The rate of extraction in the 1880s had reached a level comparable to the ancient operations. The industrial machinery of the 19th century had achieved what the ancient civilization's machinery once achieved in terms of scale and depth of penetration into the rock formations surrounding the lake. It is possible, speculative but not irrational, that this penetration was detectable from below, that the vibrations, the structural disturbances, the changes in the hydrology of the deep systems announced to whoever was down there that the world above had once again attained a certain threshold, that the time for renewed contact had arrived. If this is correct, then the boy was not an accident of proximity. He was a response to a signal, even if those transmitting the signal had no awareness they were doing so. The miners drilling into the Lake Superior Basin in 1887 and 1888 were, in this interpretation, knocking on a door, and the door opened. Reverend Harrow, in the final paragraphs of his letter, describes sitting alone with the boy on the last evening before the men from Washington arrived. The boy was not sleeping. He was sitting in his characteristic posture, hands folded, eyes open. But on this evening he was not speaking, he was simply present. Harrow writes that he felt in those hours a peculiar quality of attention emanating from the boy, not surveillance, not judgment, something closer to what he calls archival interest. As if the boy was looking at Harrow the way a person looks at something they wish to remember accurately. As if the encounter was being preserved, Harrow writes that before leaving he asked the boy a direct question. He does not record what the question was. He records only the boy's response, a single sentence spoken slowly and clearly, the boy looking at Harrow without blinking. Harrow could not comprehend it, but he writes that as he departed the room and stepped into the winter air, he was seized by the strong and inexplicable conviction that the sentence had been an answer, that whatever he had asked had been understood, and that the response had been precise, and that the precision of it was not diminished simply because he lacked the framework to receive it. The ice of Lake Superior stretches for miles in every direction in winter. Below it, the water descends to depths that change character as you go down, colder, darker, under pressures that intensify with every foot of descent, into zones that have been charted only in the most general sense, where the bottom is not truly a bottom but a transition into rock, and the rock is not solid but fractured, and the fractures run in directions that no map produced from the surface can fully trace. Somewhere in that unmapped depth, in those unmapped passages, if the framework holds, something continues to operate, something that remembers the copper, the mines, and the civilization that operated them, something that observed the boy's return or failure to return, and drew its own conclusions about whether the world above had changed sufficiently to be approached again. Whatever exists on the other side has spoken once, in a language we can no longer hear, through a child who appeared at the edge of the ice on a February morning in 1888 and looked at the men who found him with the calm recognition of someone who was not lost but arrived. We filed the paperwork, we took the photograph, we classified the report, and we went back to work extracting copper from the ground, knocking on the door from above without knowing we were doing it, waiting for an answer we would not recognize when it came. The boy's name was never recorded, or if it was recorded in a language for which the record keepers lacked the alphabet. He passed through the institutions of 1888 America like water through stone, leaving traces too minute to constitute clear proof, but too consistent to constitute coincidence. His expression in the photograph is the final element, that expression of distance and clarity. The expression of someone looking at you from a very great depth, not with hostility, not with pity, but with the patience of whatever precedes and follows the particular century in which you happen to be standing, with the knowledge that what has been lost can, under certain conditions, be recovered, and that those conditions are not entirely beyond the reach of those willing to look down into the lake and consider seriously, and without flinching, the possibility that it is looking back.